welcome to my digital talk. Today's title is US Defense and Security Policy Post-Covid-19. And my guest today is Franz Stefan Gabi, who is Research Fellow for Cyber, Space and Future Conflict at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's focused specifically on future conflict and the future of war operating out of the IISS London office. Now, we have a lot of issues to unpack today, and I would like to use the opportunity to start immediately with the very hot issue of German-American relations. Now, yesterday, the US President Donald Trump confirmed in public for the very first time that his administration is planning to cut the US military troop presence in Germany from its current level of roughly 35,000 to a reduced force of 25,000. That was linked to Germany's failure to reach a 2% spending threshold agreed by NATO member states in 2014. Now, some analysts are linking it also to the refusal by the Chancellor Merkel to participate in the planned G7 summit in Camp David. But of course, there is much more. Now, I would like to ask Franz, what is your assessment of these current developments, this obvious deterioration of the relations between Germany and the United States? And what do you think will be the implications specifically for the security and defense field when it comes to the transatlantic community? Welcome, Franz.
Thank you very much for having me, Valina. It's a great pleasure to be in your program, and I should perhaps say at the beginning that I am actually in the United States at the moment. I'm not in London. I was supposed to relocate to London for my new job, and the pandemic intervened, and I'm still in New York at the moment. And I think we picked a really interesting week to discuss US defense and security issues. Lots of stuff that's happening, and we saw President Trump's remarks yesterday, and I thought that it was just fairly interesting how he phrased it, first of all. I do think it's somewhat of a repeat that we've seen over the last couple of years. Trump always coming up with this idea that Germany is not paying its dues for NATO, which is not true, as most of us probably know. It's really much more about individual national defense budgets and not the overall budget for NATO. That is the issue here, the famous 2%. But I think overall, when it comes to this US-German debate about NATO, I think there's perhaps 3 points that are worth considering here. First of all, it's nothing new, really. This debate about the United States pulling out troops from Europe, or specifically Germany, has been going on since essentially the 1950s. We tend to forget that there was a big debate prior to this general consensus in American foreign policy based on containment and a more interventionist defense and security policy during the Cold War years in the United States about what the role of the United States should be. And it was not a natural given for the United States to station troops all around the globe. And this debate about moving troops back to the United States has been going on for so many decades, and it constantly has been flaring up. So this is, in my opinion, not really an exception. I think what really makes a difference now, though, is with Trump talking about it. Usually these sorts of announcements or discussions, even internal discussions in Congress or the White House, are usually accompanied by a big public statement on U.S. commitment to NATO, or a U.S. commitment to U.S. European security, and that's something that has been missing. So I think that's one point here. My second point, I think, would be that this debate is really very much internal in the United States. And it doesn't really affect the German public too much. Frankly, a large portion of the German public doesn't really care whether the United States is withdrawing some troops from Germany or not. It really has, I think it's a question of semantics when it comes to national security in Germany. I think for most Germans, when you talk about threats or national security threats, most people would still think that the one thing they associate with it is probably a land invasion of Germany. And if that's not happening, it doesn't really matter. National and defense policy does not really matter when it comes to NATO. So I think this idea has not really arrived in German minds that there are other threats also that need to be dealt with globally and also in Europe that go outside this idea that Germany is defending its borders against Russia or any other conventional adversary. So I think they're not really too worried about it. And I do think that this is really much more about the United States having this debate internally, and also, frankly, Trump probably trying to punish Germany for something. And as you said, maybe it has something to do with the relationship between Merkel and Trump. And there again, the presidents, for example, in the 1970s, you had a really bad relationship between the West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter came into office in the late 1970s, also on an agenda where he wanted to pull out troops from all around the world, move them back to the United States. And Schmidt and Carter got off to a really, really bad start. Schmidt thought, well, rather Carter actually thought that he was that Schmidt was interfering in elections, because a few weeks prior to the election back then, Schmidt gave an interview in which he praised the Republican candidate Gerald Ford, the sitting president at the time, and he really didn't think much about of Carter's foreign policy expertise. He really considered him this peanut farmer from Georgia who doesn't really know enough about nuclear deterrence, enough about NATO-Soviet relations, and he really was fairly disdainful of Carter, and that only really changed towards the end of the tenure of Carter. And I can go more into this. I guess my last point is also that the troop presence in the U.S. troop presence in Germany is not really so much about defending Germany, although that certainly plays a role in defending Europe. It's really that the United States military presence in Europe has really become much more about the U.S. projecting power into the Middle East, into Africa, into other regions. And over the last decades, at least, particularly when it comes to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so it's not so much about combat troops being removed from Germany. Germany for the United States is also this gigantic staging area, this gigantic logistics hub with big military hospital, for example, big NATO maneuver grounds for conducting military exercises. Then you have 2 of the 6 geographical combatant commands, U.S. African Command and U.S. European Command in Germany. So there's just a lot of logistics that are really converging in Germany. And I'm saying all this to say that at the end of the day, no matter what decision the president is taking on this issue, it's not going to impact U.S. or NATO conventional deterrence against Russia, the only real conventional threat in Europe, and it's not also impacting U.S. nuclear deterrence against Russia. And I have to say that a lot of the reasons why you have U.S. troops in Germany to begin with had to do with nuclear deterrence and not so much with anything else. So perhaps let me stop here, and I don't want to go on for too long, but basically how I'm framing this.
Well, you also posted today a very interesting quote by Henry Kissinger to Franz Josef Strauss from 1972, saying, "You simply cannot expect the US to defend an economic competitor. You simply cannot expect this to go on indefinitely." Now, obviously, the security matters are the one side of the coin, but then on the other side of the coin, we see growing rift in terms of geoeconomic interests between United States and China. We will talk about it later, but also between the United States and the European Union, respectively German, as this industrial heart of the European Union. Is it possible that security and defense matters and issues that you've named, for instance, the nuclear deterrence? We've seen recently that the Social Democrats basically brought back the topic of nuclear weapons on the discussion table, a long, I mean, forgotten issue, let's put it that way, for at least for the last decades, now being revived in the internal discussion between the Great Coalition members. So on the other side, if we expect that relations between the United States and Germany will deteriorate because of these geoeconomic aspects, Trump named the Nord Stream 2.0 gas project with Russia, but also 5G, Huawei negotiations with China that were actually going on prior to COVID-19. So issues that are very, very important for the US security and geo-economic interests that are on this side of the Atlantic actually being perceived in a different way. Do you think that this would actually lead to a kind of a deterioration between the European and the American allies within the transatlantic community? Do you think also that Germany will be pushing more for this so-called strategic autonomy, so-called European army, if you like, which is more or less, let's say, kind of a still hot air debate, which media is using for, articles and for PR attention, rather than it's really filled with substance behind it. So how do you think this is going to develop in the next half of a year, let's say prior to the elections, but definitely also given that we are going to witness US elections this year?
Yes, I think there's a lot of stuff to unpack here. And let me just, first of all, perhaps answer this question about deteriorating relations between the United States and Germany. I think that's somewhat overstated. I do think that the majority of policymakers in Europe and in the United States still think that European and US national interests are actually much aligned on a lot of issues, and I think that's something that we consciously have to strengthen also over the next couple of months, no matter who is going to sit in the White House. My second point would be that these sorts of tensions are really nothing new. Again, going back to history, there's always been this tension between European defense commitments and European free riding on US underneath the US nuclear umbrella, for example, or even under the US conventional force buildup in Europe. So this has been going on, and then all these accusations of the United States against Europe and its allies in Asia, primarily Japan, about not paying enough and about not contributing enough to all of this. It's somewhat of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, the United States wants Europe to be more independent and invest more money into defense, but then of course it also wants to maintain a certain amount of influence. And I think when you look at some of the documents that have been, for example, circulated during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, so Bush 1, and then also under Clinton, and even under Reagan, the idea of the U.S. presence in Europe was not always so much really about defending Europe, as I said. It had much more to do with the United States maintaining a substantial troop presence on the Euro-Asian landmass for geopolitical reasons and also for the U.S. national standing. And close relations with NATO essentially also built mostly upon this idea that through NATO, the United States can influence European affairs and prevent another world war or another regional conflict, at least, from happening in Europe. So there's very much a historical consciousness that factors in the legacy of the First World War, where the United States withdrew from Europe, and then a couple of decades later it had to engage again in another conflict. And I think that's still heavily weighed on U.S. consciousness, at least among a certain policy elite in Washington, D.C. My second point, I think, would be that essentially, whenever transatlantic relations really got into trouble, the Soviet Union or Russia bailed the two continents out. In a sense, whenever you had a new commitment, whenever you had a crisis, let's say in the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson, the Vietnam War, and Johnson was really upset that Europe didn't really contribute any troops and thought that the Vietnam War was nonsense. Or like even in the 1950s, when you had the Suez Crisis and France and the UK were really told by the United States, your times or your days as a great power are over. Or like all the way into the 1970s also, when I was talking about this disagreement between Carter and Helmut Schmidt and a couple of other European leaders about the future of NATO. The Soviets always did something that sort of saved NATO, and consequently also the US troop presence in Europe, particularly Germany. You had the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, if I remember my date correctly. Then you had the Prague Spring in 1968, where the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia, and then of course in 1979 you had Jimmy Carter, the Soviets invading Afghanistan, which triggered a very bellicose response from Jimmy Carter. And also recently in 2014, again, you had Russia seizing Ukraine and invading the Crimea Peninsula and also invading eastern Ukraine. And all of this together again gave new life to NATO and also made Europe again much more prominent within US strategic thinking. Now, having said all of that, what European leaders need to realize, and also what German leaders, need to realize, is that the United States doesn't see Europe anymore as its primary field of interest when it comes to geopolitics and national security. It's pivoting, or it has been pivoting, to Asia. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind when we discuss all of these issues, because no matter what's going to happen and no matter who is going to be in the White House in a couple of months from now, I do expect a drawdown of U.S. troops eventually, and also less U.S. defense commitment to Europe in the long run. This doesn't necessarily have to mean over the next couple of years, but definitely over the next decades, I think it's going to be somewhat of a reduced U.S. footprint in Europe, and that I think is something that we really have to consider. Now, and as to your question about strategic autonomy, I just don't think it's realistic. And I do understand where it's coming from, this debate, and why a lot of people think that this is important, that we are this pole in between China and the United States in this new age of multipolarity. I know you have different opinions about this multipolar system that's emerging, or at least I think you think that it's not really emerging, but I do think that it just can't happen in Europe how we envision it in many ways. And I do think we have to somehow find a way to find better ties with the United States, get closer to the United States, no matter what differences we have, because I think there are really no alternative, for the simple fact that I don't think European policymakers can be convinced to spend more in defense. They cannot be convinced to really develop some of those key military capabilities that you need in order to secure Europe's security, particularly when it comes to the periphery of Europe, but also really power projection capabilities beyond Europe that go into other regions of the world. I think it's massively expensive. And then also, what is really how can you sell this really to the public if there's no real threat? And that brings me back to this idea of threat or distorted threat perception in Europe, where what I mentioned earlier, the German public, for example, really largely still thinks about a threat being mostly a land invasion or like a conventional attack. And I think we've done a really good job of them conveying this to the wider public, that modern warfare, or even the future of warfighting, is moving into different directions, and we are moving into the cyberspace, the electromagnetic spectrum. It's information warfare, it's the cognitive space that's really going to play a huge role, and this is really something where borders are no longer going to protect you.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of threat perceptions, there's definitely one particular shift that is very interesting when it comes to the U.S. Security and defense policy, and that's called China. Now, the USA and NATO actually started the year 2020 with big plans to practice vital military skills. At the NATO, the last NATO summit in London, China was identified as a potential threat for the very first time. On the other side, strategic documents initiated by US administrative bodies and also by Pentagon actually pointed also to the emerging potential threat coming from China. Now, and then again, COVID-19 hit, and some of these discussions were, of course, were set aside in order to focus on the health crisis. But the expectation, of course, is the one that that this is going to go back on the table. Now, the administration also announced its determination to pull out Middle Eastern, to pull out from certain battlefields, and you gave some examples, in order actually to focus on countering the rise of Russia and China. So now these two countries are actually often mentioned together, what I've been calling the dragon bear threat. And on the other side, many of the actions by Trump pointed to a different direction, such as the decision to send thousands more troops to the Middle East, or the killing of Iranian commander Soleimani at the beginning of this year. It almost seems like as it was in a different decade, but it happened this January with followed escalation of relations between the United States and Iran. So there is obviously a situation in which certain perceptions and threats are still the same, the case with Iran. But then again, China is certainly going to be in the middle of US policy, strategic policy documents. Now, I would like to ask you how this is also coupled now with the military budget plans. The number is 741 billion that the White House has been rolling out. And how do you see actually this Russia-China focus in the broader context of future operations, future planning, defense planning? And I would like to hear your assessment on this military budget debate, as we know that China has also been pushing for an increase of its military budget. And the military budget discussion is always something that on this side of the Atlantic has a very different, assessment. Mm-hmm. So what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's so much to unpack here. I hope I'm not going to forget anything. You just have to jump back in and remind me in case I haven't answered a question. So perhaps let me start off with this idea that has been really going around in the United States within the strategic community here over the last couple of years, and is also reflected in documents about a new age of great power competition. And the United States, or rather the Pentagon, defines great powers essentially as a nuclear armed potential adversary who can conventionally challenge the United States. So that's very broad. And there are really just two countries for the United States that can do that: A, Russia, and B, China. The United States, I always say the United States, the Pentagon considers Russia a declining great power and China a rising great power. And that's also reflected in various documents like the National Security Strategy from 2 years ago, the National Defense Strategy, and then also the National Military Strategy, which are the three principal documents when it comes to overall national security and defense policy that sort of offers strategic guidance for the rest of the US government in this new age of great power competition. Now, what these documents have in common, essentially, is that they all say we are in this new confrontation with near peer or almost peer competitors. And we have to constantly be engaging with these countries. Everything is competition now. The lines between peace and conflict are blurring. And because of that, we need to make some substantial changes. And so when it comes to the national defense strategy, which I think is probably the most important document of the three that I mentioned within the defense community, and if you look closely at what all of these, of what all the other branches within the Department of Defense and the individual services, military services in the United States have been doing, is they've really, really tailored their responses and their initiatives and their new projects really in accordance with the national defense strategy. And that defense strategy is supposed to be valid for at least 5 more years, I think. Having said that, you never really know. When there's a new president, I think either way, we'll probably have a revised document next year or in 2 years from now. Even if Trump stays in power, I think his new cabinet is going to be so different that we also will have most likely a somewhat changed strategy. But I think the core about refocusing on China and Russia is going to stay in place. And this also includes what you mentioned, this gradual drawdown from the Middle East. However, having said that, in the national defense strategy, for example, it specifically speaks of a 2+3 formula when it comes to national security prioritization. You have China, Russia are the first two, and then the other 3 are North Korea, Iran, and global terrorism. So I think it very much is in line with what the national defense strategy says, and I think the United States is very much focused on Iran besides anything else in the Middle East. It doesn't really want to remain engaged in Iraq for its own sake. It wants to remain engaged in Iraq and in other parts of the region to detain and deter Iran. And in the long run, I think that the United States will not be able to do all of these 5 things, because for the first time also the debate has taken place in the United States defense circles about the idea that the United States might not be able to dominate as much the warfighting space as it used to over the 1990s and the 2000s. This idea of a new age of defense without dominance is now hotly debated in the United States. And I think it's a very, very interesting time to be now in the United States and be a defense analyst, because I think there might be a fundamental shift when it comes to these issues. And this, interestingly though, is right now debated. It's in papers, and new so-called operational concepts are being developed, like new ways how the United States is going to use its military. New strategies are also developed, but it hasn't really properly been reflected in the defense budget. And now I come to the defense budget, because in many, many ways, what you see when you look at the defense budget is that a lot of this old legacy force structure within the military is still in place, and a lot of money is getting poured into legacy systems that can't really, or are not extremely helpful when it comes to competing with China, whether it's in wartime or peacetime, or the so-called gray zone area, that area that I described earlier, that's somewhat in between war and peace, this perpetual competition between the great powers. And to me, that's very striking. A lot of people think 750 billion. I mean, it's an insane defense budget to have, but when you look at it in detail, there's not really a lot of room to play with for defense planners. It's a substantially, how should I put it? It's really a really, really bad process that needs to be overhauled, how the US defense budget is drafted, how it's passed. And it really very much goes back to this problem that a lot of people have identified over the years, called this military contractor, Congress, and Defense Department complex, essentially, like this iron triangle, as it's called in DC, where you have Congress, defense contractors, and the Department of Defense, and all 3 have very specific interests when it comes to the defense budget, and all 3 interests are often not aligned, and they sort of paralyze one another in many ways. So whenever the Pentagon wants to cut a program, a weapons system that it thinks is no longer needed and that doesn't really reflect military realities, Congress puts it back in because of the lobby because defense contractors are lobbying, although that's also sometimes overstated to what degree these defense contractors are successful when it comes to lobbying. It's very often just really for the individual congressmen or senators to keep jobs within their district. The U.S. defense industry is really a big player in all of this, much bigger than in most European countries, and that's what I think Europeans often forget. But all of this together really creates this atmosphere where it's really difficult for the United States to make any substantial changes in its defense budget. And I think in the long run, this is really going to undermine U.S. military readiness. And of course, that's really complaining at, or like arguing at a fairly high level. I don't think U.S. military preeminence is in any danger in the long run, not from China for a while at least. And I do think though that there are some structural issues that need to be addressed when it comes to the U.S. defense budget. And one small item, for example, that I think often doesn't get a lot of play is how much money the United States actually spends on its soldiers. And just in terms of monetary compensation, just how much it actually pays its soldiers for its missions. I mean, if you are private, if you enlist right after high school in the United States military, in the U.S. Army, I think you make something around $40,000 or $45,000, which is a lot of money for anyone who knows anything about military pay. That's a lot of money that you pay an individual soldier, and then you get all the other benefits and perks that come with it, all the subsidies. And if you're an officer, if you go to one of the big service academies here, like West Point, which is about an hour and a half from where I am right now, you get commissioned as a second lieutenant into the U.S. Army, and then you make about 70, 75,000, 80,000 on occasion, which is again a lot of money. And in addition to that, you have all the other perks again and benefits that you get with that. And then of course you have big pension obligations, other sort of expenses, and part of that also factors into the defense budget. And I think that's something that's growing fairly quickly within the budget. Right now it's about a third, and that's really going to substantially increase also over the next couple of years, in my opinion. And that again also cuts into this idea that the United States, in this new age of great power competition, where it needs to confront China and Russia, can really invest in new weapon systems and in restructuring its military forces. I think that's definitely something that needs to be taken into account here. And perhaps let me stop here, whether you have a follow-up question. I forgot whether I answered all your questions here.
No, you covered quite a lot, but I would like to add a minor question to it that's related also to military budget, future military plans, that is the Indo-Pacific region, because it's also being present in the US strategic documents as one of the future playgrounds of global and regional power competition. Now, knowing that India is striving to become the third largest economic power by 2035, according to projections. Of course, we should be very cautious about this kind of projections, but still, India overtook Great Britain and as an economic power, which is quite significant of a phenomenon. And having these two regional powers as direct neighbors with nuclear weapons, and having in mind the rapprochement between China and Pakistan, and also against the background of the regional geostrategic plans by China to expand geographically, also through the economic corridor in Pakistan to the Indian Ocean and to get to Africa, but also on the other side through Russia, through Central Asian countries, to get connected to Europe. Now, obviously, for the United States, there is going to be the new role, and of course, for US, probably future US troops deployments, this new role of finding new allies, strengthening old alliances, for instance, with Anglosphere allies such as the Five Eyes, members, but also specifically in Asia, there are already old allies of the United States that still very much rely on the United States help in dealing, for instance, with China. So my question to you is how do you see this kind of possible developments? Will we witness, for instance, future redeployments? Maybe some of these troops will be probably just redeployed to other regions or other parts that we haven't expected yet. And we probably will see a kind of not just redeployment, but also, you know, investment of in future security and defense pacts. It doesn't have to be a strategic alliance in the way that we understand it here in the within the transatlantic community, but maybe a sort of an alternative to NATO, an Asian NATO. How do you see this? Is there any kind of reference or discussion among the US security and defense experts and colleagues when it comes to these possible developments, knowing that China is already, for instance, investing in also a kind of a pendant of NATO in Asia, that is, for instance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, even though that it's not being described as a security organization yet. We have, of course, discussions about anti-terror activities and operations. So we have definitely security matters also on the table. This is a very broad picture, but you can decide which part to take.
No, it's a great question again. And well, let me first perhaps start with this idea. I think what you are talking about is really crucial to understand also this new age of great power competition, in my opinion. This idea that the United States, unlike Russia or China, do actually can rely on a host of allies in Asia and both in Europe, and I think that's really its underlying strength in many ways. Now, what's interesting is that for the first time, at least since I've been in the United States, and I've been here since 1999, you really have a big debate about the value of alliances. You actually have to justify to certain segments within the establishment, or rather the DC policy crowd, the value of alliances and why the United States is actually stronger with allies, which I think is very telling in itself. And I have to say that I don't think a lot of these I mean, what I found interesting is that a lot of people see this as self-evident, that the United States needs these strong alliances, that the United States needs NATO, that the United States needs to be engaged in the world. And I think people have gotten a bit lazy when it comes to that, and have also started using sort of stock phrases when it comes to discussing it. Sort of like, you enter a debate about something that is seen as self-evident. Well, the United States needs allies, and makes allies actually make the United States stronger. And there hasn't really been a very detailed debate on why that's the case. And I think it's very healthy for this debate to be happening right now in the United States, generally speaking. And it is happening. Now, that's one point. My second point is specifically to Asia, at the role of India, US-India relations. I think it's somewhat overstated. I don't think India, for example, will ever specifically commit to the United States. It's never going to be an ally for multiple reasons. It's just not in India's nature to do so. It really wants to be more neutral, perhaps, although let's see what's happening this week. There's this border dispute between China and India that has flared up again this morning. I think there were a couple of people killed yesterday evening along the Sino-Indian border. But I wouldn't really overstate what this really means for India's overall new direction when it comes to its relationship with the United States. I think the United States wants to push India toward closer ties, and there is actually a lot of military cooperation that has been happening over the last couple of years, and that's strengthening for sure. But I don't think we'll ever see a proper India-US alliance, for example. At the same time, also, I think India and China at the tactical level, and I think that's what we saw yesterday, and that stuff can always happen. There has been an escalation, but I do think that both India and China at the operational and strategic level are really trying to deconflict and also find a dialogue to solve this dispute peacefully. So that's one point. Overall, I have to say I have to go back to the national defense strategy again, because I think it is sort of a guiding, a good departure point to discuss any of these issues. And what's interesting there is that the national defense strategy paints the picture that it's extremely difficult. It will be extremely difficult for the United States military to protect power into Russia and China and into Europe and Asia overall. So they're very much worried that the old model of the United States, the expeditionary warfare model, where there's a conflict happening somewhere, the idea would probably be the 1991 Gulf War, where the United States built up its troops for a couple of weeks and months, and at some point, according to its own time and place, decided to attack. In this instance, it was Iraq. I think that sort of like the national defense strategy, that this is really over, and they really need to think hard about force postures and about repositioning its troops around the globe. And they want to specifically find means to break through what is called an A2AD bubble, anti-access area denial bubble. These are certain capabilities that China and Russia are fielding in order to really deter the United States from entering a conflict, and in order to really keep U.S. forces at bay. And a lot of stuff that's happening or has been happening over the last 2 years in the United States has really been mostly about trying to figure out how to push through this A2AD bubble. And it's not really just in the kinetic dimension. That is, it's not really just conventional warfare. You have cyber, you have all these other dimensions, and they've been working really hard in the United States at the conceptual level, at least for now, to really work through these problems, these military problems, these operational problems in Europe and in Asia. And I think that also will require good alliances. And I think that's sort of the weak spot within that national defense strategy, because that document has been created under U.S. Defense, then U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. And I think it's overall a very good document, but it sort of, where the single weak spot that I detect, or that I have actually also talked about in the past, is really alliance. Is really how to maintain alliances and how to really convince European and Asian allies to really do more when it comes to this new force posture and new positioning of troops, and also what do you really do if you don't really need a lot of these troops? Because, as I said, we're moving in a different direction when it comes to warfighting, and I think a lot of people often mistake presence with deterrence. That is, in order to deter your opponent from doing something, you need to have a substantial troop presence in place, let's say in South Korea or in Japan or in Germany or in the Baltics. And the direction of warfare is really heading into a different direction, really. And I think that's something that's often misunderstood, because we're really moving away from this weapon system / net platform centric approach that's really mostly about tanks and artillery and fighter aircraft and all this other stuff, which is nonetheless going to be important in the future. We're really moving away to a more network centric approach, where it's really about fighting each other's network, degrading each other's networks in order to win in any sort of great power competition that also could at some point really become a high intensity conflict or a real war between the great powers. And I think that's something that policymakers in Europe have to be aware of, because I do think sometimes European policymakers are really in a different planet when it comes to some of this stuff in comparison to US policymakers. Whenever I go back to Europe and I talk to some defense planners and so forth, it feels to me like often we are really back in the early 2000s or even 1990s when it comes to discussing some of these issues. And that's not really because they don't get the idea, it's just because the money is not there to fundamentally transform European or Asian militaries. And I think that's going to be a big problem in the long run if the United States moves toward more of this network-centric force structure, and also repostures its overall global forces, and how the United States allies in Europe and Asia are going to fit in. what sort of issues are going to arise there, particularly when it comes to interoperability, for example. That would be a big thing. How can these forces actually work together? And then, of course, again, you have the question, is this going to weaken or strengthen conventional deterrence? Not so much worried about nuclear deterrence in this instance, because I think nuclear deterrence, no matter what people here are thinking in the US, will remain strong. For NATO and the United States, I'm not worried about that. But when it comes to conventional deterrence, I think some gaps could open up because of this shift. So yeah, so long answer to multiple questions. But I do think that the National Defense Strategy is a really good document. And I should say, though, a lot of the document is classified, and this is really based on my own research, what I'm telling. But there's a lot of publicly accessible information available, and I do think it's a very important, if you study this document and what's been written about this document, you get a good insight about what's happening. I think the last point I have to make, though, is the bigger question, and there's really no correct answer to this, is to what degree this document is really going to influence things beyond the Department of Defense, for example. Like, because if you look at national power, you have to look at it more comprehensively, and I think this is really something that perhaps could be analyzed in a bit more detail. And my very last point is actually also that I don't think that we're going to see too much of a deviation from this national defense strategy, no matter who sits in the White House beginning next year, just because I think this paradigm of great power competition is going to remain in place. At least that's what my reading is of what's going on in DC at the moment.
Your last point was actually my next question, which was linked to the US election, and whether you would see a change or shift in these kind of developments that you've outlined so broadly, specifically when it comes to the future of war fighting, when it comes to future capabilities. Obviously, the Europeans have to catch up in certain areas, in certain fields. Probably the cooperation within the transatlantic community, within NATO, will be one of these fields. But then again, the European Commission announced to be a geopolitical commission, so that means it's going to also address some geopolitical tests, and probably will transfer a certain amount of funds to also security and defense projects. But still, what you've outlined as a future projection of warfighting, how actually certain capabilities will develop and will look like, do you see a certain or potential shift after November? If given that, for instance, a democratic candidate such as Joe Biden wins. Let's be honest about it, the European capitals are hoping for a win on the side of Joe Biden. I mean, the expert community is not even making a secret out of it, that there is certainly, that this certainly will lead to a positive change in the European-American relations, respectively in the transatlantic community. But still, the political specter is very important, but on the other side, we need also the technological. And isn't it that we Europeans are lagging behind quite much when it comes to the future technologies? And if not, political will be enough to actually bring some of this progress also on European soil. Let's point out, we have also Space Force here in Europe, launched by the European Union institutions. We have also some ambitions when it comes to the strategic autonomy. Even though that I agree with you, I don't see a strategic autonomy being completed on the side of any state actor. In this global power competition, there is no such thing as a strategic autonomy. We all are interdependent into a one really interconnected world. When it comes to 2020, just what is your take? Any change, any shift, or it stays the same no matter who is going to the election?
a couple of points. First of all, it's true that European leaders in general have preferred Democrats over Republicans, with some exceptions. Ronald Reagan in certain capitals was very popular. George H.W. Bush one was very popular among certain European leaders. But generally speaking, yes, Democrats are usually preferred, and I think that has something to do with European leaders just often being put off, but it's more of more cowboy-like mentality, if you want to put it, with George W. Bush, or also U.S. nationalism. Frankly, the United States calls it U.S. exceptionalism, but it's essentially nationalism, and that's something that that European leaders always had a hard time really figuring out what it really means and how to deal with it, because it's just so far off from how they conduct politics. That's one thing. Having said that, over the last decades, and this break really only happened with Trump in reality, there's been a lot of convergence on views when it comes to international politics, defense policy, foreign policy between Republicans and Democrats. So you had this elite consensus, so to speak, during the Cold War years, but also during the 1990s, this idea of somewhat of a liberal hegemony, as someone called it, or this idea that the United States needs to remain engaged in the world. It has to have a more interventionist foreign policy and a global footprint. Now, if Trump remains in power, I think some of this is again going to be called into question. I also don't think at the same time that should Biden assume the presidency in 2021.
Now I think that the connection, fortunately, broke out, and France disappeared suddenly. In fact, we were already approaching the end of this session. I had a few more questions for him. I will be waiting for him to re-enter the session for another minute or so. And actually, obviously, on this side of the Atlantic, we. Yes, you disappeared for a second. I suppose that yes.
Yes, I don't know what happened here. I'm sorry about that. Yes, no, I also heard some background noise, which was strange. I heard other people talking or whatever it was. Yeah, it was fairly strange. What I wanted to say was that I don't know when I got cut off.
Well, you got cut off just when you were pointing out that Biden. I mean, if Biden will be president by 2021.
Yeah, so I don't think fundamentally that there's going to be. We can't really return to this state prior to 2016. And I think for the first time, what Trump triggered in 2016 is that for the first time, there's an actual debate in the United States happening at the moment about the direction of future defense and foreign policy that goes outside the established perimeters. And I think it's a healthy debate. I think it's a debate that the United States should have had after 1989, and it didn't really, because you had Bill Clinton, and then you had all these smaller interventions in the 1990s, and foreign policy didn't matter that much really to the U.S., to segments within the U.S. Political establishment in the 1990s, despite Bosnia and Rwanda and all these other things that were happening. It was fairly much focused on domestic political issues. And then, of course, George W. Bush was also elected into office to reduce the U.S. global footprint. Then you had 9/11 happening, and then you had this new age of forever wars, and now this age of forever wars, as it's called, is slowly coming to an end. So Trump was at the end of this process of this decade-long fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and this war against terror and so forth. And I think for the first time now, there's an actual debate going on about the future direction of U.S. foreign policy, and I think the consensus is no longer really there to a certain degree, and I think we cannot go back to business as usual. And I think Biden, when he was at the Munich Security Conference in February 2019, said something to the effect of, well, we'll be back, or just be patient, we'll be back, and so forth. I don't think that's really going to happen. At the same time, I don't think the United States is going to withdraw from the world. Mm-hmm. What specifically I think what's going to be interesting for European policymakers is that if Biden wins, I do think we're going to see a more hawkish foreign and defense policy in reality, because there are fairly hawkish elements within the Democratic Party and the Democratic establishment, particularly when it comes to their relationships with China and Russia. So I would be very interested to what degree U.S. allies in Asia and Europe are going to be ready for a more confrontational U.S. defense and foreign policy against these two great powers. And I think one interesting aspect about all of this over the last couple of years is that a lot of the very reasonable requests, in my opinion, for Europe and Asian allies to do more when it comes to confronting, or rather deterring China and Russia, they were able to dismiss it because these things, or these demands, came from a Trump-controlled White House or a United States where Trump is president. And I think once Biden is in the White House, there are less and less excuses to really step up and also really do more when it comes to all of this. So I do think it's not going to be an unmitigated blessing for Europe and its Asian allies. If they think they can just return and seek refuge under the U.S. national security umbrella, I think they are mistaken when it comes to this, because I do think we are in somewhat of a global shift and a global repositioning of power. And I think this idea that the United States really with overwhelming force can dominate this global international system is just an idea of the past. And my major issue when it comes to Europe is that Europe just does not see any threats on the horizon. It's just a fundamentally different world that European leaders live in. They think that Russia is really a threat that's mostly played up by the United States. Of course, there are exceptions when it comes to Eastern Europe. I'm really more focused on Western Europeans. They don't really see any other big issues that can be solved by military means, and I'm really mostly talking about Germany in that regard. And the idea here is really that, I mean, it's interesting. Once the U.S. is really going to be less interested in Europe, for example, I really wonder to what degree this European cohesion, or that Europe can really keep it together, because I do think that the United States and U.S. military troop presence in Europe is the glue that holds all of this together, whether it's NATO or even to a certain degree the European Union. And we already saw what's happening when you have this wet vacuum of that the U.S. leaves behind, let's say in North Africa, for example, where you have European countries and actually former allies competing over interests in certain countries there. And I don't think that's really something that is considered often enough. And I think it's something that's also getting put like, you know, if this is not a problem that we have to deal with next year, there's really no incentive for policymakers to really see any sense of urgency to deal with all of it. So I do think that it's not possible to go back to business as usual, no matter who is going to sit in the White House in a couple of months from now. And I also would say that perhaps Biden is not the best, or I think there might be a rude awakening for some European policymakers once Biden assumes power, because I do think there's going to be a much more hawkish foreign policy that we can expect from the United States. Having said that, Trump's foreign policy and defense policy is going to be so unpredictable, and I do think that Trump's second term is going to be very different from the first term, and I can only, I wouldn't really make any bets in what direction that really develops.
Mm-hmm. Now, our time is running out, but I would like to ask you a final question, which is more of a domestic character, but still, even in this U.S. domestic issue, the U.S. military received unexpectedly public attention. And as you might guess, my point is about the ongoing social unrests. Now, the U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper criticized the actions of the Minneapolis police, in whose custody George Floyd died. And he called also the action murder and a horrible crime. He also did not support invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy active duty forces to quell civil unrests, but the debate about the possible role of the US military is now on the table, and the use of the Insurrection Act has been also discussed, as Trump has actually talked about using the military to quell violent protests on the streets of US cities. So my final question to you is: do you expect rather obviously undesired role of the US military in such a domestic issue, given that the social unrests continue escalating prior to the US elections, and knowing that Trump will make sure to stabilize the situation, and due to the fact that he can now not rely on a positive economic outlook due to the COVID-19 situation and post-crisis situation, he would make sure to stabilize the situation so that he actually has good preconditions before running for the presidential elections in November. How do you see, what's your assessment, how do you see these developments from the perspective of the US military once again?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and a couple of different things to say about that. First of all, there's always been, the US military has always played a very substantial influence on politics in this country. It's never been apolitical. Military officers pride themselves to be publicly apolitical, and there are a lot of norms that have been established over the years to sort of keep the United States military out of civilian decision-making processes. But my point has always been that just by its sheer presence, its sheer size, and the global nature of the United States military presence, the military has much more influence on decision-making, vicariously has much more influence on decision-making and foreign policy and defense policy than the militaries in other countries in the world. There's about norms and to what degree Trump and certain members of the armed forces have violated norms. Now, Trump has a very ambivalent relationship to the military. There are certain segments of the military that support Trump, others are really opposed to him. So it's not like one clear-cut. You can't really say that the military is behind Trump. What I've noticed, though, is that there's been a general sense of relief last 2 weeks ago when it became clear that the military, or the defense secretary, and also the chief of the Joint Chiefs, the highest-ranking military advisor to the president, openly spoke out against some of the policies that Trump suggested during these riots and also protests. And what I find interesting generally is that this is also not something that's particularly new. And going back and tying it back perhaps to our initial discussion about NATO and Germany, the annus horribilis of post-war US history, in my opinion, would probably be 1968. 1968, domestically and internationally, for the United States was a fairly pivotal year. It was a year where you had massive protests in the United States. You had the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where there was extreme police violence against protesters. The Democratic Party was in disarray. You had the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War in 1968, where for the first time a large portion of the American public realized that they're probably not going to win that war. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King. You had the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, a contender for the Democratic nomination for president in 1968. The entire country was really up in flames, and there were protests and riots, and all of this was taking place. And that really had a lot of leaders in Europe, ambassadors and so forth, extremely worried about whether the United States would be able to maintain its global presence and would actually still be committed to NATO with all this unrest that is happening. And I think in many ways we have this debate now again, because I find it interesting that we have these intrinsic and intricate models on deterrence, conventional deterrence, nuclear deterrence, military power, and all of this. And there are debates about alliance cohesion and so forth. But the most obvious problem that we have right now is that the United States doesn't present a picture that is very enviable, that is very, very much, other countries want to emulate, or, a country that you really can say is the primus inter pares in the international system based on what's happening here. When you see the pictures of a country slowly tearing itself apart, I think there's somewhat of a cognitive dissonance in this country when it comes to the foreign policy elite and the rest of the country about what the future direction of the United States should be, but also what other countries see when they look at the United States. And I don't think it's a pretty picture. And I do think, and I'm glad that you actually asked this question about like the domestic dimension of all of this, because I think it's an underappreciated factor. Because we can talk all about wanting to contain China, wanting to compete with China and Russia, and a new age of great power competition. But if domestically things are not in order, it's going to be very difficult for the United States. And the United States did pull through in 1968. It elected Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon, no matter what flaws he had, he was a fairly good foreign policy. He was very good foreign policy news for the Europeans, and also for the Asian allies of the United States. And really, to your point about Trump's election strategy, also just occurred to me. I have to think about Richard Nixon, because what he did really was he coined, or he developed, what has been called the so-called Southern strategy, by which he really wrestled away the Southern United States from the Democrats. The Democrats had dominated that part of the country electorally for many, many decades prior. And Nixon had a campaign strategy that really emphasized law and order and appealed to the so-called silent majority, like those people who are not protesting. And he really appealed to law and order people. He really appealed to the evangelical voters in the South, and also really appealed to latent and rather blatant racism in certain segments of U.S. society, to mobilize them and to vote for the Republican platform in the election. And if you are careful and if you read Trump's tweets, you see that he's essentially trying to emulate that 1968 strategy. He tweets about law and order. He tweets about the silent majority. He really tries to play off these protests against the law and order politics that he wants to implement. And I do think there's the danger that he can actually, I shouldn't say danger, there's the potential that he can actually succeed in doing so. Although, of course, many, many things are different. But I do think you have a major problem when you look at polls in the United States with what is called, I think, like a falsification bias. I don't really know the specific term, but it's essentially what you have in Austria or in Germany with country when you do polls and not a lot of people wanting to publicly express that they're voting for the AfD or the Freedom Party in Austria. You have the same problem here when it comes to polls. A lot of people that you ask are actually not openly going to admit that they're going to vote for Trump. So I think polls have to be somewhat taken with a grain of salt, in my opinion. And I do fear that this is something that can be repeated. You also have to understand that Biden is probably the weakest Democratic candidate in decades. The less he talks, the more successful he is. And I think that should tell you a lot about the caliber of what a candidate he is, which is really it's not very, very comforting, I think, for Democratic voters. And then you also have really the Democratic Party splitting into different factions. And the question is, how much can they really unite or like cast aside the differences and really focus on Trump? But then also on the within the Republican Party, you have different segments and different factions competing for influence. And I do think when it comes to foreign policy, what's going to be interesting in the long run is what's really going to happen to the moderate Republican wing that sort of dominated Republican foreign policy for decades. Principally all the expertise, the foreign policy expertise within the Republican Party lies within the so-called never-Trumpers, people who openly opposed Trump during the 2016 election and also refused to work for his administration after that, and what's going to happen to these people if Trump wins. That's going to be interesting because they are sort of discredited in the eyes of Trump, and their policies are little by little trickling through the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is still very much dominated by Democratic and Republican moderates in many ways, like this sort of permanent bureaucratic class. Trump has referred to it as the deep state. But this is definitely something that I think one should ponder. Having said all of that, I don't think there's that much difference between moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans when it comes to questions of defense and foreign policy. So there might not be that much of a shift. But I do think if Trump stays in office, I think these people are really little by little going to be moved further away from the center of power. And I think that's also going to be very interesting to what degree this is really impacting the long-term direction of U.S. defense and foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Franz Stefan Gadi, thank you very much. You've covered all relevant developments and issues related to the U.S. security and defense policy post-COVID-19 in just 70 minutes. Thank you to our listeners, watchers, for staying with us all the time. And for those of you who are interested in the research work of Franz, please visit him on the webpage of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or follow him on Twitter. Franz, thank you very much for your insights and your contribution, for staying with me for the last 70 minutes.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, and all the best to you in Vienna. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.